Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing October 2025 clubs for Spellbinders. So first off, we have the Merry and Bright wax seal of the month, along with basic mix wax beads. And then we have the Glimmer of the month called Magic Wonderland. And along with that, we have some polished brass glimmer foil. This is gorgeous for those foiled backgrounds. I'm also going to be using a couple different colored foils as well. Then we have the BetterPress of the month called Made with Snowflakes. These are absolutely adorable, these little snowmen. The clear stamp in the month, and I also have the coordinating dies to go with it, is called To You and Yours. And there's a lot of different sentiments in there, perfect for winter and holiday cards. A lot of these for this month are perfect for winter as well as holiday cards. That 3D embossing folder is called Brick by Brick. It might just be my new favorite embossing folder. It's so basic, but it works fantastic. Then the embossing folder of the month called Holiday Flurry. The stencil of the month called Frosty Wishes. That snowman face is just adorable. The stitching die of the month is called Peppermint Prancer, absolutely sweet as well. This is the large die of the month called Window Wonderland. I'm going to be using that main Gazebo for one card, and then I'm going to be using the sled and little child for a second card. Then we have the die of the month called Snow Day Friends. That one also has a tree with it that I'm going to combine with the sled and child die from the large die of the month. Our caboodle item is called Magic for You. I'm going to make a card at the end of this video with that. And I'm using one of the cards from the holiday expansion pack for the DIY deck as my color inspiration. I wanted to do something that was not something that I would typically go to. So I'm doing mostly blues and pinks. I'm going to pull in a tiny little bit of green as well as a touch of gold to match with the wax beads as well as the foil. I'm going to start off with making some wax seals. Now, even though we have a basic wax mix here, my thought was when I do winter cards, I tend to lean towards more silvers. So I'm going to do one gold seal to go with that foil, but then I'm going to be doing a silver seal, and then I'm going to be pulling in some ink wax beads, which is a nice dark blue. I wanted that to coordinate with some of the blues that I'm using in the cards. Now, full disclosure, I end up only using the wax seal or the gold wax seal for my cards. I still have the silver one as well as the blue one that I can save for another project. In the end, while I was creating, there just wasn't a card that I thought those would be absolutely perfect for. So I opted not to use them in this video, but I do use the gold one that I make. So this seal is a square seal, and when you use it with the wax, you get that bubble on the side of the 4 different sides there. So what I like to do with it is I just like to trim them off with my detail scissors. Now, I don't want to have swirls of different colors in these particular wax beads, so I am taking some dry paper towel and cleaning off my little melting scoop between each and every one there so that I don't have any of the other colors swirled in there. If you like that look, you can do that. And sometimes I do like that look, but for these particular cards or what I was having or the ideas I was having in my mind, I didn't want to do that. So any of those pieces that get trimmed off, I put them right with my wax beads. They can get remelted, so they're not to waste in any way, shape, or form. I just like the look of that wax seal better when it's trimmed. Personal preference. There's some times with those squares that I'd like the bubble or that little bit of wax on the end or on the edges. Today it was not that day. So I have that silicone scoop or silicone spoon that I often use to clean out the excess wax that is in my little scoop there. It's silicone, so once that wax is cooled, it will peel right off. So it's a great tool to have, and I often use that when I'm cleaning up. Now, to make the letters on my wax seals pop a little bit more, I like to use Posca markers. Here I'm using a black one on the silver. I would have preferred to use a dark navy one, but I didn't have one. This is one of the reasons why I ended up not using this particular seal, because I had a card that I had it in mind, but it had a lot of navy on it. So when I put that wax seal with the black ink on there, to me, it just looked off. I didn't particularly like it, so I opted not to use it. But this is a great tip for making the letters on these pop really, really well. For this navy one here, I'm putting some silver Posca marker on there. So I just color the upper level of the letters and then I let that dry. Sometimes when the wax seal has just been made, it likes to kind of resist that ink. So sometimes I do need to go over those letters a second time. The second time, for some reason, it takes the ink a little bit better, and then I do let it completely dry. On my gold one, I don't put any Posca marker on that wax seal at all. I just leave it as it is. For that particular one, I felt like you could read it enough that it didn't necessarily need it, as well as the fact that I couldn't really think of a color that I wanted on it. And I'm glad that I didn't do it because I ended up using it on my first card and it works perfectly the way it is. So next I'm going to do my hot foiling. I'm going to hot foil the Glimmer of the month, which is the Magic Wonderland. This one is perfect for backgrounds for winter cards. There's a lot of little tiny snowflake looking pieces as well as some hearts in there. So I think it would be fun to use with Valentine's as well as a background because of those little hearts. I'm going to do my backgrounds first and then I'm going to foil those sentiments. So I have a piece of that polished brass foil. I'm working on some indigo cardstock, so that dark navy there. I just thought that polished brass would look really great on that dark color. You could also do it on white hammermill cardstock and then do ink blending on it. I will do some or a background on that hammermill cardstock and do ink blending, but it won't be the polished brass. So I did that one with the polished brass, and now I'm going to work on some windy cardstock, which is a nice light blue, but I'm going to use some Prism speckled foil for these backgrounds. I love using that speckled foil for kind of snowflake backgrounds because it just adds a little bit of extra shimmer to it. Now I will be using the speckle foil to do some sentiments, but I won't be using the sentiments on the card. I don't actually like the speckled foil for really tiny sentiments because for me, it's a little bit harder to read. So I'm going to be using just regular Prism foil for those sentiments. It is going to coordinate with that speckled foil, but it's just going to be a lot easier to read. For the last background that I'm going to be doing on hammermill cardstock, I'm using that opal foil, which I just showed, but you can see when you roll it off of the roll, it's really transparent. So it's really hard once you've cut it off to see which is the pretty side and which is the not pretty side. So which side goes against the glimmer plate and which side goes against the cardstock. So I always cut that right before I use it. I make sure that the side that goes against the glimmer plate, which is the outside of the roll, is facing down on my desk, so then I can just put it right on that plate. This has a beautiful opalescent shine to it, but it's transparent. So whatever color you put it on, you're going to see that color through there. I'm doing it on white because I want it to appear that those are white with that opal transparent shine to it. And I'm going to do some ink blending to make those really pop. With my backgrounds done, I can do my sentiments. So I'm going to do some sentiments with that polished brass so that I have something that's going to coordinate with that background that I did with the polished brass there. Now, for some reason with these small sentiments, I often get overfoiling with them. A tip that I had on my last club video, someone said to put them this way in your glimmer system to not get that overfoiling. I still get it. So I thought this was going to be the solution, but it is not. So I will show you once I'm done my foiling how I fix it. So that was that speckled prism foil. I won't even be fixing those because I know I'm not going to be using them because, like I said, I have a really hard time reading the sentiments when they're done with that speckled prism foil. So I'm just doing it with the regular prism foil. I really like the sentiments done with that. I still get some overfoiling, not nearly as much as I did with that prism speckled, but there's just a little bit there. So I'll show you how I fix that. Before I fix those, I'm using my solid hot foil plate and doing my solid hot foiling of all of the foil that I've used. For these sentiments, because I had a bunch of overfoiling, they're not going to be usable sentiments, but what I intend to use is the space all around them. I will be using them for mats around a couple of my sentiments, and most of the time I take those pieces and I use them for die cutting little pieces when I'm doing die cutting. This works as a perfect substitute for specialty cardstock, and it's much easier to store that foiled onto that cardstock rather than the flimsy pieces of negative foil, as well as the fact that the flimsy pieces of negative foil, if I were to store that, there's a good chance they get damaged. They wouldn't solid hot foil in the future very well, so I might as well do it now while my machine is hot And I mostly am going to be using some of these larger pieces for mats around some of my cards anyway, so they will be getting used right away. The ones that I definitely won't be using are the solid hot foil pieces for the sentiments, because they're not nicely foiled. If that first foiling for the sentiments doesn't work well, the solid hot foiling isn't going to work for cards either. So like I said, those ones I tend to use as specialty cardstocks for die cutting. I won't be using them for die cutting for this video, but I will be using it, like I said in a minute ago, that I will be using it for a mat at least around one sentiment. So once I'm done my solid hot foiling, and the solid hot foiling is exactly the same as foiling with a regular plate, you're just using that solid hot foil plate. Mine's made from Pink Fresh Studios. It's a nice size, so it's just a little bit larger than an A2 card base, so it works perfectly to use for the pieces of foil that I have, as well as to use for different mats. Sometimes I'll, like with this particular sentiment here, it's a half a sheet or a half a quarter sheet, so it's 2.5 or 2 3/4 by 4 1/4. So that works perfectly on that solid hot foil plate as well. So I just take that clear piece off of the side of that foil, and then we're good to go. So here's my polished brass piece. The first way that I fix and clean up that overfoiling is by using some Best Ever craft tape. This one here is I think it's the 5/8 inch width one. I do take a tiny bit of sticky off of it first before using it. I just put it on my shirt or my pants a couple times just to make it just a little bit less sticky. When it's right off the roll, sometimes it's just a bit too sticky and will rip the paper. But by taking a little bit of that off, you can make sure that it doesn't do that, as well as the fact that you can do what I'm doing here and kind of burnishing it on that cardstock. Once I have taken as much of that excess off as I can with the tape, then I go in with a sand eraser. Sometimes that tape is enough and it takes off the right amount. These particular ones, I have some excess overfoiling, so that sand eraser is going to work perfectly for it. When I'm using it though, I am very careful to not go over top of my foiled letters, because it does change the finish. It's a sand eraser, so it's going to have that grit to it. It's going to change the finish of your letters on there. So I am careful to not go over any of those pieces that I want to make sure are nicely foiled. Once they are cleaned up, I can set those aside to trim in just a moment. Now, sometimes when I do that, I can't get all of it off. Sometimes there's the odd mark on there. What I tend to do for those is I tend to do ink blending on those sentiments, and that will hide some of those imperfections. So some of the sentiments I will go and say choose a dark ink, and that's sometimes because it goes with the card better, and sometimes to hide a couple imperfections that would show if I kept it white cardstock. I do find by using that Best Ever craft tape, often I don't necessarily need to use that sand eraser. Sometimes there's the odd little place where I need to use it, but most of the time that takes off as much of the excess as I need, especially for the inside of the letters, like the inside of an A. Often that gets a little bit overfoiled because when you're removing it from that clear sheet, that little tiny bit of foil doesn't come off with it. So by using that Best Ever craft tape, you can clean that off easily. So here's a comparison between that speckled foil as well as the prism foil. Now, like I said, I didn't clean the speckled foil. I knew I wasn't going to use it, so I didn't want to waste time doing it. But you can definitely read the prism foil sentiments way better than the speckled prism foil sentiments, which is one reason why I tend not to use them, but it's a lot easier to see that than to just hear that. So once I have my sentiments cleaned up, and it's much easier to clean up those sentiments when they're on that full sheet than once it has been trimmed. I use my trimmer to trim down those sentiments. When I'm doing that, I am using the edge of that clear ruler there as a guide to make sure that the blade of my trimmer is straight against those sentiments. Then I will flip it around and I will do the same thing. And when I flip it around, not only am I making sure it's straight with the letters of the sentiment, but I'm also looking at the left side of that sentiment to make sure there's an even space between the edge of the paper and, say, the edge of my little guard there, just to make sure that I have an evenly trimmed sentiment. So I'm going to do this with all of my sentiments so that I have all of them done and ready to go. There's no point in stopping in the middle of card making to do this. So I like to do it all at once so that they're all just done and ready to go, and I don't have to go and trim something in the middle of everything. So for my first card here, I'm going to be using that navy background with the polished brass foiled background. I'm going to be using the solid hot foiled piece as the mat. And even though we have some white images from that solid hot foiled piece in the background, it's still going to work perfectly as that mat. So all of the cards that I'm creating in this video are A2 cards. So I trimmed my foiled background down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. That solid hot foiled piece I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My sentiment, I do ink it with some chipped sapphire distress ink just to hide some of those imperfections like I was mentioning before. And because it makes it really dark, makes it harder to see on that background. So this is where I use the solid hot foiled sentiment piece to trim down and use as a mat. So when I do that, I do glue it right to that piece there, and I trim it while it's on there just to make sure that I have an even edge around the whole thing. This is what works best for me, but what you could also do is measure the size of that initial sentiment and then cut a piece that's as big as you want it for the amount that you want to be exposed around it. By doing it, by gluing it the way I do right onto that foil, to me it's just a good visual. I can see how much I've got on the edge of one side when I glue it down, and I can just trim that same amount. Typically when I trim it though, I do trim just a little bit extra. It's always easier to cut off a little bit extra than it is if you happen to take off too much. The other thing, when you glue it right to that foil, that glue doesn't set for a little bit because that foil is a non-porous surface. So you will have that flexibility to move it if you don't necessarily have both sides exactly even. Now, once I put it on that foil, I liked it on that background, but it didn't pop quite as much as I wanted it to. So I put it on a piece of white scrap cardstock. This way it's going to echo the mats that I have on my card. So when I glue it on when I glued my background on my card, I have a white mat around it from the base of my card. So this way I'm going to have a white mat around my sentiment. So it's going to echo that as well. And this is the card where I'm going to use that gold foiled wax seal. It just worked perfectly with the background. I didn't want to completely hide that background, but I also wanted to add just some pop of gold to coordinate with that polished brass foil there. So by adding that wax seal, it just worked perfect. So first I'm going to glue down that sentiment, make sure it's nice and centered. And then I could glue down that wax seal nice and straight, but I thought it looked nice, just a little bit cockeyed, just a little bit crooked. I'm using a wax seal sticker to glue that on. The sticker is a round one and it's just a little bit bigger than my square. So I'm just using my detail scissors to trim down that excess. And then I can glue it right down on my card. Now I've also used my Barely Art glue to glue down those wax seals, and that works well as well. With the stickers, you don't have any wait time, so that's always nice. So with that one done, I'm going to move on to the BetterPress of the month. This one is called Made with Snowflakes. I absolutely love this adorable little background here. So I am using it with my BetterPress system. Sometimes I'll use my BetterPress plates with my Glimmer system, but today I thought I wanted to watercolor these images. So I have some distress watercolor cardstock here that I'm going to be heat embossing these images on. When you use the distress watercolor cardstock, there's two different sides to it. One that has kind of some texture to it, like bumpy texture, almost orange peel-ish texture. The other side is fairly flat, and I use the flat side, especially when I'm doing heat embossing on there, because I want to make sure that I get a nice crisp image. I use some embossing powder tool on that cardstock and then ink my plate up with some Versamark ink so that that embossing powder is going to stick to it. Put the clear plate onto the base and run it through my Platinum 6 machine. Now, there was two different ways that I wanted to do this. I couldn't decide which one I liked best, so I thought I would experiment with you. So the first background that I wanted to do was with holographic glitter cardstock. I thought those snowmen would look absolutely adorable with that glitter cardstock or glitter embossing powder. However, I wasn't sure how it was going to look when it was watercolored. Spoiler alert, I didn't like it. I didn't finish it. But I wanted you to see the beginning part of it. And I'll share when I'm doing the watercoloring some of the ways that I probably would alter it might be better that way. But you really have a hard time seeing the images on the background. So they don't really have a whole lot of definition to them. So you're kind of relying on the watercolor to do that for you. And because the glitter embossing powder has that texture to it, it's hard to make it look nice and precise, if that makes sense. So once I have this embossed, I'm going to repeat this same process. The second background I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be embossing with Lost Shadow Distress Glaze. Distress Glaze is an embossing powder, but it has a transparent look to it. So if I were to do this on dark cardstock, you wouldn't really see the Lost Shadow because it's a really light color. But for these snowmen, it's going to give the definition that I want, the lines around them that I want, but they're not going to be super dark. So they're not going to be black. I didn't want anything dark as in black, and I also didn't want anything metallic, so I didn't want to use silver, so the Lost Shadow is absolutely perfect for it. I repeated the same process. I used that embossing powder tool on my watercolor cardstock, and I'm working on the flat side of the watercolor cardstock. Inked my plate up with Versamark ink, put the clear plate on the base, ran it through my Platinum 6 machine for that pressure to press that pattern into the cardstock. And now I'm pouring on that Lost Shadow Distress Glaze. And yes, you can be liberal with it. I'm working on scrap paper, so anything that goes on that scrap paper goes back into the jar, so there's no waste to it. Then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder. And you can see right away that those images are much easier to see. So it's going to be much easier for watercoloring, as well as the fact that with the Lost Shadow powder, it has a nice smooth finish to it. It doesn't have the bumpy finish that the holographic glitter powder had to that. So we're just going to have a nicer look with this. Now, when I'm doing the watercoloring for this, I didn't want to watercolor my entire background. You absolutely could if you wanted, but I wanted to keep it fairly subtle and just wanted the attention to be on the snowmen. So before I work on my watercolor, I do want to heat emboss my sentiments. There's 3 different ones in this set. I wasn't sure which ones I was going to be using for which cards, so I like to have lots ready. When I'm doing my card making, I like to have lots of choice there. So I did all 3 sentiments. I did it in the Lost Shadow, same as what I had just heat embossed my snowman in. And I also heat emboss it with some Chipped Sapphire Distress Glaze. This way I have some sentiments in that navy. Now, you don't have to emboss when you're using the sentiments. You could just use ink for them, but I always love the embossing because it gives it that dimension as well. So you have the raised dimension from the embossing powder, and it just finishes off really nicely. You also have the gloss from that embossing powder. Sometimes I like those sentiments just with ink, but it just depends on the look that I'm going for. Sometimes I really want to have it with that embossing instead. But that's one of the things I absolutely love about the BetterPress system is that you can use so many different types of inks and you can use so many different types of paper. So the options are really broad. So once I've done my heat embossing with the Lost Shadow Distress Glaze, I'm going to repeat that same process and go in with the Chipped Sapphire Glaze. For some of the inking that I'm using in some of my cards, I'm going to be using that Chipped Sapphire Distress ink, which is why I opted for that particular color so that it's going to coordinate with the ink that I'm actually using. And I love the fact that there is distress glaze that coordinates with a lot of the distress colors. So it makes it nice and easy to color match like that. So once I have my plates inked with that Versamark ink, I put the clear plate on the base, put it through my Platinum 6 machine, and now I can pour that embossing powder on there and use my embossing tool to melt that. Now these sentiments don't have dies to them. You could go and look in some of the past clubs for dies. There probably are some that are going to work for it. I just use the same method as I did for doing my hot foiled sentiments. I just used the trimmer to trim around those sentiments in order to use them on my cards. And I did that off screen. You saw me do it already with the foiled sentiment, so there's no point in doing it with these ones on screen as well. I knew this video was going to be long already, so I didn't want to waste time with repeating things. So to start off with, I'm using Lost Shadow Distress Refill. I often use my Distress Refills for watercoloring. I already have the refills for re-inking my ink pads. I really like using them for watercoloring. They're nice and convenient to use. The inks themselves have a lot of color to them, so I often will use a lot of water to dilute them, so you can get a lot of color range or shade range of that same color. So I'm using that lost shadow just underneath each one of those snowmen to give it a little bit of shadow to make those snowmen look a little bit more white. Now, if you wanted, you could use some blue, so like pale blue or whatever, to color the sky behind the snowman if you wanted. Again, I wanted the focus to be on the snowman. I didn't want to do a whole lot of coloring behind and around the little snowman, so I wanted to just do that lost shadow there. I also plan on doing something to the snowman to make them pop a little bit more. So I have a little palette here that I have all of my Distress reinkers. It's called the Alcohol Ink palette. Used to be the Distress Ink palette. It doesn't really matter. It's exactly the same thing. It has these little wells in there. So I have my different colors of my reinkers in each one of the wells. And what I do is I put a little label to the bottom right of each one. I write down the colored name on that label, but then I take a little bit of that ink and color it on that label as well, so I can see the exact color shade. So often, especially with the dark colors of this, they just look dark in that palette. So it's really hard to see exactly what the colors are. So by doing this, I can see exactly what the color is supposed to be, so I can pick and choose my colors a little bit better that way. Now, the one thing to know about those Distress reinkers in this palette is they will never dry. So this has to be stored horizontally. You cannot put it vertically, or just all the ink will run out of each well and into each other and make a huge mess. So it has to be stored horizontally. The other thing, you don't necessarily need to have a palette like this. If you just wanted to put, say, a drop of ink on an acrylic block or a non-porous surface or your glass surface or whatnot, you could do it that way. I do a decent amount of watercoloring with my refills, so for me, it was worth it to have palettes dedicated to it. And I will typically only put a drop or so of each color in that palette. It doesn't need to be filled up, but by putting a drop there, I can easily add a little bit of water to some on the side and just have a little bit of control. My water brush has water right in the handle so that it makes it really easy to change colors. It also makes it easy to take excess color off of that brush. I have a piece of paper towel to my right that I will often use to just take off some of that excess color. So as I'm coloring that same Lost Shadow Distress ink on my background with the holographic glitter embossing powder, I'm realizing that it's really hard to see those snowmen. So what I start doing is using that lost shadow to color the snowmen a little bit. And then I realized that my snowmen are gray that way. So I took some, I think it was weathered wood distress refill to start coloring in the background so that those snowmen popped a little bit more. And I just really didn't like the look of it. So that's where I ended up stopping with this. The way I thought it would look cool in my head did not work when I was actually doing it in real life. So that's sometimes something that happens, right? Sometimes you have an idea and you think it's going to be fantastic and revolutionary or whatever, and it just doesn't work out. So I didn't like the fact that the Lost Shadow made those snowmen gray. And so that's where I decided to add a little bit of weathered wood to the background to make them still white but pop a little bit more. Again, I just didn't like it. It wasn't the look that I was going for. So what I end up doing, like I said, is I just abandon it. I don't actually finish the image. Once I decide that I'm never going to use it and I don't like the look of it, I typically will just pop it to the side. Sometimes I'll go back to it and have an idea and of a way to fix it or whatever, but I just really didn't like how it was looking. And I was happy with what was happening with the one that I had done the Lost Shadow embossing for. I really liked the look of the light gray outline for each one of those snowmen. I typically like to do embossing when I'm doing watercoloring because it gives that little bit of a ridge between the different areas. It makes it a little bit easier to do that watercoloring and make sure that that ink is going to stay where you want it to. If you use ink that doesn't have that ridge, like a permanent ink or whatnot, you need to make sure that one area is dry before you work beside it. Otherwise, you're going to end up contaminating the colors. They're going to start to run into each other. So for the accessories for these snowmen and for these particular ones, it's just basically the hats. I am using some chipped sapphire distress ink. I'm also using some weathered wood distress ink, and then I'm also using some sponge sugar distress ink. So the sponge sugar is bringing in the pink tones that I'm using with the color palette that I'm going for. I don't do a lot of pink hats for this, but I do a few of them. Another option would be to add some evergreen bough ones, which are the greens. I end up using more of the greens towards the end of this video. And I didn't really think about it for this particular project, but it would be a great addition to add some green hats, bring in a little bit more of those holiday colors there. And that evergreen bough is just a really nice green that has a bit of a blue, almost teal tone to it, which is really, really pretty. So once I have the hats done, I'm going to be coloring in the stick arms for each one of the snowmen, as well as the noses. Rather than using distress inks for it though, I'm going to be using some Tombow markers. The Tombow markers have a brush end on one end and a fine tip on the other. So it's just going to be much easier. These areas for both the stick arms and legs, or arms, and the carrot noses are really, really fine. So it's just easier to use a marker for that. Before I do that though, I'm going to use some sparkle splatter accents. I've been using this for a couple months now to use it for splatter on backgrounds. It makes a great snowy background. It makes us a great splatter background. It also comes in Raven, which is a black that has a gold shimmer to it. This one has like a silvery pearly shimmer to it. But the bottle has a nail polish type brush. So I'm using that brush to color in the snowman. So this is going to give the snowmen themselves some snowy shimmer. It's going to give it a different texture than my background. It's one of those things that you don't see when you're looking at it straight on, but when you tilt it into the light, that light catches that shimmer and it just adds some fun texture to it and something surprising, and it gives your eye something that it's drawn to. So by having a little nail polish brush right in here, it makes it really easy and convenient to use. You don't have to grab a separate brush. You can use that nail polish brush. These snowmen are they're not intricate images. They're just little balls. So that brush is perfect for it. I wouldn't use the brush if you wanted to have something really detailed and intricate, because there's no point to the brush. It's got a pretty blunt end to it, just like a nail polish brush has. But for this particular purpose, it absolutely worked perfect. The sparkle accents, or the splatter accents, doesn't take very long to dry. I think I maybe gave it like 5 minutes tops. It dries really quite quickly, so you don't have to wait a long time for it to dry either. Another option here would be to do stickles, which would give those snowmen some glitter on their bodies, but I didn't want to hide the details like the eyes, as well as the button or the snow or the pebbles, rocks, whatever, as well as the fact that I knew I wanted to add a little bit of stickles around the brim and the ball of the hat. So I didn't want to have it on the hat as well as the whole snowman. So this was a perfect solution for that. Another option would have been, say, like a sparkle pen, or there's a product a few years ago, and the name of it is blanking me, but it's got some shimmer to it as well that you can paint on. That would be another option as well. Would be really good if I could remember the name of it, but it's escaping me right now. So once that completely dried, I used the Tombow markers to color in the stick arms. So for that brown, I'm using 977. And then when it comes to the carrot noses, I'm using 933. Again, any brown or any orange would work, but the markers worked much easier than it would have to paint in all of those areas, because they're really quite fine and detailed. It's possible to paint them in, but the marker was going to be just a lot quicker. And it's easy with the ridge from the embossing to just get into the little areas there. So once I have that done, I'm ready to add the stickles to the brim of the hat, as well as the little pom-pom thing, and then I will let that completely dry. And typically when I let stickles dry, I kind of overestimate the time. There's not a lot of area there, so I think I let it dry for about 45 minutes, and it was good and dry before trimming it down and assembling my card. It just adds that really beautiful shimmer around the edges of that as well, though, which again catches the light. The stickles itself you do see head on when you're looking right at the card, but it also adds some really beautiful shimmer and glitter to it that's different from the sparkle splatter accents. Now I put my piece here on my sticky mat while I was doing the watercoloring, and I've left it on there while I did the splatter accents, while I did the coloring. You could take it off if you wanted to turn it around and move it a little bit more. It just worked best for me to just leave it nice and stationary. My sticky mat definitely has to be washed though, so you can see while I'm using it, it's actually moving around on my surface. It'll get washed at some point, I'm sure. but it worked perfect for holding everything stationary. And that way I had something holding the piece of paper while I was doing what I was doing. So once that had completely dried, I can trim it down. I trimmed this one down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to use a piece of indigo cardstock for my mat, and I'm trimming that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So we have a nice frame around it. And really you could use any of the colors, like the light blue that I have in the cards, or even the pink. That would be nice as well, because it coordinates with the colors that I used with the snowmen. Or if you're using other colors, obviously you could use other colors as that mat. It just frames it really nicely. Then I chose one of the sentiments that was embossed with the chipped sapphire distress glaze. So this one says made with love and snowflakes. I thought that was absolutely perfect for this particular image. I didn't do a mat around that sentiment because I wanted the focus to be the snowman, not necessarily the sentiment. But you could, if you wanted to frame that sentiment a little bit, you absolutely could do that. For the next card, I'm using the embossing folder of the month. So this one is called Holiday Flurry. I'm using the stacking on my Platinum machine for 2D embossing folders, for regular embossing folders. I'm using some regular hammermill cardstock, and I'm going to do a technique that I absolutely love doing with embossing folders. It really brings out the pattern of the embossing folder. I use some Best Ever Craft tape to tape that cardstock in my folder, and then I embossed it. Sometimes I'll do the first embossing without the ink, and sometimes I'll do it with the ink. For this one, I wanted to make sure those images were nice and crisp, so I made sure to do it without the ink first, and then I took my chipped sapphire distress pad, ink the opposite side, and then close it, run it through my Platinum machine to ink that background. So when we're doing this, we're inking the background of the embossing, not the raised part. So when you tape your cardstock in your embossing folder, you want to feel it. And if you can feel the image raised, that's the side that you tape the paper to, your cardstock to. The other side will be the background raised, and that is the side that we're going to ink or put the ink on. That way it is inking the background of your embossed image. I use distress inks for these because it works really, really well. It's also water soluble, so it's really easy to get off of your embossing folder. You could use permanent inks if you were doing it on a surface that needed permanent inks, but then you would have to use a special cleaner in order to get it off of your embossing folder. Now, I could leave that background as is and have all of those embossed images white as they were when I just inked that background. But I wanted to add a little bit of that green tone to the greenery. So I'm using a detailed ink blending brush with my Evergreen Bow distress pad. And I'm just starting at the stem or the base of each one of them and just kind of lightly feathering the ink out. I'm not completely covering those branches with ink. The end of the branch is going to have the darkest amount of ink, and towards the tips of the leaves or needles, it's going to have less ink. So a lot of my tips on them are white, but we have a lot of green on them. So it just adds another color to it. It just makes that background just a little bit more interesting. I'm going to keep this card really, really simple because that background is really quite pretty and unique. I've never seen an embossed background that has both snowflakes and greenery. So I just really liked that. Wanted to keep it very simple. So my embossed piece, I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I have that solid hot foiled piece of the speckled prism foil, and I trimmed that to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So we're going to have a mat around our embossed piece, but it's going to be really, really thin. I didn't want that speckled prism foil to really take the focus away from our embossed image, but I wanted it to frame it. I wanted to add just a little bit of sparkle. I'm also going to be adding some little gems to the centers of the snowflakes. That's going to coordinate nicely with that sparkle. And I'm also going to be using some of the solid hot foiled prism speckle foil to do a mat around my sentiment. So it's going to have that sparkle around the sentiment as well as my embossed piece. So just like I did for the first time I did this, I glued my sentiment right to that solid hot foiled piece. Then I put it in my trimmer and trimmed the edges down to make sure that I had an even area around my whole sentiment there. I just really like how it just it just adds some sparkle to it, and it coordinates with the mat that I have on there. Sometimes when you have embossed images, they're just, even though they have that dimension to them, because they don't have any sparkle to them, it ends up being a little bit flat. So this just adds a little bit of a different texture, a little bit of a different finish to this card. But I do keep my mats really thin for this because I don't want them to overtake and overpower my embossed background. So once I have that sentiment done, I can glue that on. For the gems, I'm using the opal gems. So they have a white base to them, but I have a nice kind of an opalescent shimmer to them. I'm using the smallest size of them. And I'm also using my tool-in-one to pick up or to pierce in that adhesive behind the gem, place it in the center of my snowflakes, and then I use my finger to just press that down and make sure that it's got some good adhesion to that snowflake there. You could use a little bit bigger size gems for the larger snowflakes. I used the smallest ones for all of them because I wanted to have that sparkle there, but I still wanted that embossed image just to be the focus. So I left that, I left it with just the tiny gems, so they just have a little bit of light. If you don't have gems, another option would be dots of stickles in the center of the snowflakes, would give a similar look to it. For the next card, I want to use that brick by brick embossing folder for my background. Again, I think this one's going to be a favorite one that I use for a lot of things. I love the size of the bricks. I love the texture, and it's just great for backgrounds. So I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here that I glued into, or that I used some Best Ever Craft tape to tape into my embossing folder. I embossed it before adding any ink, and now I'm using some Versamark ink. So this is going to add Versamark ink in those grout lines for my background here. What I'm going to do after inking it with that Versamark and embossing it is I'm going to put some of that Lost Shadow Distress Glaze on there and heat emboss it. I want to ink the upper part of my bricks, but by having that embossing glaze on the background, first of all, it's going to give a different texture, a different finish, because it's going to have that glossy finish to it, but it's also going to resist when I do my inking on the top of the brick. So I'm not going to accidentally get any ink on the inside or the grout lines of my bricks. Another option here, if you wanted it to be white, is you could use some white embossing powder or some clear embossing powder. You would still get that difference in finish, so you would still get the glossy look for the grout, but it would resist any ink that you used on the top of the bricks. So this is just a great way to add different textures, and I wanted my lines to be gray, so that's why I used the Lost Shadow. But I also wanted that white background for my ink, so I wasn't changing my ink colors by having a colored piece of cardstock on here. Another thing is, even though this is a 3D embossing folder, there's not a whole lot of depth difference between the upper and the lower part. So this just makes it easy to ink that upper part without having to worry about accidentally getting ink between those brick areas and between those grout lines. So once I poured that Lost Shadow embossing powder on there, I used my embossing tool to melt it. It's really easy to see when it's melted because it goes from that matte granular look to that nice glossy finish to it. I left my Best Ever Craft tape on there while I was melting that powder. This is all going to be trimmed down anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So I'm trimming this piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I actually trim it down after I do my inking. But to add a little bit of difference to my inking, I'm using mostly blues, but I'm adding a little bit of spun sugar distressing, or just a little bit of color difference. The great thing about bricks and brick backgrounds is that you can get really creative with your colors. They come in so many different colors that you can have fun with it. So I thought the pink was something that was a little bit unexpected. Really, blue is too, because you don't see a whole lot of blue bricks, but I wanted to go with the color palette that I was using. So I started with that pink, or that spun sugar, then I went in with the weathered wood, and lastly I went in with my chipped sapphire and just darkened some of those areas. Then I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to make another one of these brick backgrounds for a card later, and I'll change it up just a tiny little bit with my colors, just to show you another different variation, but you can get really creative with their color combinations. Now I like that background, so I wanted to have something for a focal point on the front. So I'm using the clear stamp of the month, and I'm using the tree image. So anytime I have a new clear stamp, the very first thing that I do to it is use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It takes away any possible manufacturing residue on there. And sometimes that residue likes to resist ink. So this just helps that stamp take ink just a little bit better. Then I use a brush just to clean off any possible eraser bits. Now to stamp my image, I'm using my Misty stamping tool to make sure that I can stamp it multiple times and stamp it in exactly the same spot. I use a little bit of embossing powder tool on my mint cardstock and then use Versamark ink on my stamp to stamp that image. I stamp it multiple times just to make sure that I have a nice, crisp, clean image. It's hard to see the image on camera, but in real life, when you kind of look to it to the side, the light will reflect off the ink, so it makes it easy to see if you have a full image to it. For this particular one, I'm stamping it with, or I'm embossing it with silver embossing powder to add that metallic shine to it. Once I have that powder on there, I can use my embossing tool to melt that powder. And then there's a coordinating die with the stamp set that I'm going to tape in place. I always like to tape my dies in place before die cutting. That way I can make sure that it doesn't move on me in the die cutting machine. I just use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape for that. And I also use those pieces of Best Ever Craft tape multiple times. I want to say about half a dozen times before it doesn't really stick anymore. So I get a lot of use out of that tape. The only time I never reuse my tape is when I am doing my embossing backgrounds in the embossing folders with ink. Then I get ink all over that tape and there's a good chance that I'm going to get it all over other things. So those pieces of tape I only use once and I toss away. But when it comes to taping dies down and things like that, I reuse those multiple times. I used a little bit of the evergreen bough distress ink to ink around that tree, and then I am ready to start assembling my card. So I'm using a piece of indigo cardstock for the mat on this one. So that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. My brick piece is trimmed to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. When I put glue on the brick piece, I want to make sure that I have glue on the areas that are recessed. Those pieces are the ones that are going to have contact with my mat underneath. So I want to make sure that there's a decent amount of glue on there so it's going to adhere properly. There's a lot of areas on that brick that is raised. So I want to make sure those recessed areas have good contact with the background. Then I glued down my tree die cut using that same Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle. It works perfectly for gluing little die cut pieces together like you'll see in just a moment, but it also works perfectly for gluing my cards together. Now the front of the card, even though there's a lot of texture to it, it's somewhat simple because most of it is that brick and then the stamped and embossed tree. I wanted to also incorporate one of the sentiments from that stamp set, so I stamped that on the inside of the card with the evergreen bough distressing, so it coordinates with the ink that was used to ink blend around the tree in the front. And then I wanted to add a little bit of a different finish to, or a different color to the front, so I'm using some gold gel pen to color in some of the accents on that stamped and embossed tree. I'll use some stickles on the star at the top just to add that little tiny bit of sparkle to the star. Another option for the star would be to use some glossy accents just to make it nice and gold but glossy. But I thought the stickles to it would just add a little touch of sparkle to it. That gold really does add some extra detail to that tree and kind of frames in the sentiment. It says a very Merry Christmas to you, so it frames in that sentiment. So once I have the stickles on the top there, I do use the tip of my tool-in-one just to kind of pull the stickles out to the points of the star. And then I stuck that to the side so that it can completely dry while I'm working on my next one. So my next one is going to be using the Snowman, the Frosty Wishes stencil of the month. This one is absolutely adorable and so easy to use. So I have a quarter sheet of hammer mill cardstock here that I have on my sticky mat. The stencils have registration marks on them, so that makes them easy to line up. I will often use some painter's tape to put a mark at the top left and the bottom right of my stencils just to make it easy to line each of the layers up. And then I'm using a piece of painter's tape on the top right and the bottom left just to make sure that that stencil stays in place. Even though there's a border around my card, sometimes those borders aren't quite enough to stick to the sticky mat. So by having that painter's tape there, I can make sure that it's stuck really, really nicely. So for the first layer, the ink blended part does the background. So I'm using some weathered wood, and then I use some chipped sapphire. So there's a little bit of a darker blend on the top. The next layer is for the cheeks as well as the hat brim, and I want those to be pink. So I start with my spun sugar distress pad. I'm using some Spellbinders large ink blending brushes for these. You can get a really nice light ink blend with them, but you can go back in and deepen that. So I really like having the control over this. These brushes are fantastic for backgrounds, and when you're stenciling for larger areas, I wouldn't use them if they are stencils that have a lot of fine areas that you want in different colors. For those, I would use some smaller brushes, but for these backgrounds, they work absolutely perfect. Next, we have the layer that does the hat as well as the eyes and the mouth. I'm using some Hickory Smoke Distress ink for that. I didn't want it so stark and black as sometimes I have done. I wanted them to be just a little bit lighter. So the Hickory Smoke is the perfect color for that. If you want, you absolutely could go in and do a dark color, do a dark black here. But like I said, I wanted them to be just a little bit more muted. I wanted the only dark color in these cards to be the chip sapphire, the dark navy or whatever. So I didn't want to compete with that by adding black here. And I really actually like it with the Hickory Smoke. It just works well with the background as well as the pink accents. This next layer here, we have the nose. So I'm doing that with dried marigold. You can do it with whatever color orange you want. I just wanted it to be not super, super bright. Again, I wanted to kind of go with the muted color tones that I was using for the rest of the accents. Now that stencil that I used for that carrot, I put it to the side. I'm going to be using it again in a moment, but I need to put in these details from the last stencil first. I did the details on the carrot with that same dried marigold. This guy has some eyebrows, so I did that with the Hickory Smoke to blend in with the other grays here. And then there are some details to go on the brim or the sash or the band on the hat. I did that with the picked raspberry, and then I used the picked raspberry also on the little scarf towards the bottom. Now, once I am done with these, I can take this stencil off, and I want to add some texture to my guy here. He looks great, but stenciled images tend to be a little bit flat sometimes. So one of the ways to add that extra texture is by using different mediums. So to start off, I'm going to be using some transparent gloss texture paste. This is from Reindeer, just to cover the area of the carrot nose. Now when I'm doing this, I'm using a palette knife and I'm trying to make sure that I have a nice even coat. When I first did it and put the excess back in the container, I realized that it was just not quite even along the top, so I just pulled that back out and redid that. Once I take that stencil off, I want to clean it really quickly. I don't want that paste to dry on that stencil. Same as when I'm using glitter paste on my stencils. I take them off and I clean them really quite quickly because I don't want that to dry on there. Then the detail that the last stencil put on the brim of the hat, I'm just going to cover those lines with some stickles just to add some sparkle to it. And then the very last texture that I'm doing, there's a little highlight in the eye. I'm using some glossy accents to just give that some dimension as well as gloss. I'm going to let that completely dry, and I ended up letting it dry for an hour before trimming it down. And I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So I took 1/8 of an inch off of each edge of that stenciled image. I have a piece of blush cardstock here that I have at 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. It's going to cover my whole background. Another option here would be to use that blush cardstock as the card base. I just typically like using white card bases, so I glued this right onto that card base. So it looks like it's pink, but when you open it up, it's going to be white. And then I glued my stenciled image down. I chose a Let It Snow sentiment. This one was heat embossed with that lost shadow, so it's going to coordinate with the grays on my stenciled image, but I wanted it to pop a little bit on my card, so I ink blended it with that chip sapphire distress ink just to make sure that it popped nicely, and then glued that onto the front of the card. So we have this really easy image to create. The only thing that took any time was waiting for those pastes and the stickles and the glossy accents to dry, but it does give it some extra texture to it that really catches the light, and to me it takes it to the next level. But it would be an easy one to mass produce, to do a bunch of them, because of how easy it is to layer all those stencil pieces together. For the next card, I'm using the die of the month, the Snow Day Friends, for all of my die cut elements. I have the snowman die cut out of the white glitter cardstock from the Antique White Treasured Cardstock pack. The Treasured Cardstock packs are fantastic to use. They come in a few different colors, and they have 15 sheets in the whole pack, but 5 different finishes. So there's 3 sheets of each finish. For the white one, I tend to use this glitter one a lot for different snow pieces. It's perfect for the winter. I'll also be using the pearl finish from that one for my stitching die of the month. We'll come to that in just a little bit. So I have the snow for the bottom of the card done with that glitter cardstock, as well as my snowman. I have some anchor cardstock for behind the snowman, so the eyes as well as the little stones on the front, or the buttons on the front, are in a nice light gray. And then I have the rest of the pieces for the little boy and little girl done with indigo and windy cardstock for the boy, as well as blush and chiffon for the girl. And then they both have gray boots on them. I used a little bit of carrot cardstock for the carrot nose on the snowman. These pieces are really, really easy to put together. And this is where using liquid glue comes in handy, because it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place, and then it's stuck and the glue starts to set somewhat quickly. For some of the tiny little pieces, I do use my jewel picker to pick up those pieces and put them in the glue. That way I don't get glue all over my fingers, and it also is a little bit easier to see when you're using that jewel picker. Once I have my pieces together, I put my acrylic block over top of it. I don't use this acrylic block for stamping very often anymore, so it gives it some good use. And because it's clear, if something shifts or moves when I put it under that block, I can easily see it and adjust it. So using that liquid glue makes it perfect for those teeny tiny die cuts. Because I have it in that fine bottle, I can get little tiny dots of glue. I can also use it for the larger die cuts as well. I use it for about 90% of my gluing things together. For my background, I'm going to be using one of my Glimmer backgrounds. This one was done with that opal foil on the white Hammermill cardstock. So I trimmed that down to 3 3/4 inches, and then I'm doing some ink blending with weathered wood distress ink as well as chipped sapphire distress ink. I typically like to do my ink blending with a couple different colors just to get some color variation. If I wanted a solid color, I would use solid cardstock, and I think it just has a little bit more interest to it when you're using ink blending and you get some light areas and dark areas and whatnot. So I do the weathered wood first, and then I go in with that chipped sapphire just to kind of frame it around the outside edges. But because we have white cardstock under that opal foil, all of those foil details have that opal finish to them, but when we do our ink blending around it, they appear white with that little bit of opal shimmer to them. So I have a blush cardstock mat around this piece here. It is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, so it coordinates nicely with the die cut pieces. And if you wanted, you could use the indigo cardstock, which is the nice dark blue, to frame around it. But I just thought the blush added a little bit of contrast to it. So I start out with gluing my mat down to my card and then my ink blended background. I glued the snowy piece on that ink blended background and just used my scissors to trim it down. I wanted to make sure that it didn't extend past that piece there. For one of the future cards, I'll show you how to easily do that without gluing it down and trimming it first, just using your trimmer. It's either way works. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. They both have the same effect. So then I glued down my snowman as well as the 2 little figures on it. I chose to do a foiled sentiment on this, so I chose the one that said "Let it snow and sparkle." So this one was done with that prism foil to it, so it coordinates nicely with the silver in the white glitter cardstock that was used for die cutting the snow as well as the snowman. So we have an adorable card here with some beautiful foiled accents in the background. I think that background is really interesting and unique. It just is perfect for winter cards. The next one uses the large die of the month. So this is the one where I'm going to focus on the gazebo and the little figure, the child, and the sled. I'll be using it in the next card. So before I start to assemble anything, I have some mint cardstock here that I used for my tree as well as the string of lights. I'm using some of the evergreen bough distress ink to add just a little bit of ink blending to that. That ink blending just gives it some really nice dimension to it. Then I'm using some walnut stain to do a little bit of ink blending around my Gazebo die cut. This was die cut out of fawn cardstock, and then the accents for this are die cut out of acorn cardstock. So just a little bit dark brown there. So I was just pointing out the little sled and the child there, that I will be using that on the next one. I opted not to use it on this one, but you could easily add it to the foreground of the card and it would look fantastic as well. I chose to do white for the background, which is the part that shows on the inside of the gazebo. I didn't do any ink blending on it because I didn't think I wanted to, but once I had everything together, I kind of wish I had. I wish I had taken some lost shadow and just done a little bit of ink blending around the two sides. This die set also has some curtain dies that you can add on the inside. That would cover those the inside parts of the two side windows. And add a little bit of color there. I had opted not to use it, and that's where I had wished I had done, in hindsight, I wish I had done a little bit of ink blending on the inside just to make it look a little bit less flat. It ended up looking, just in my opinion, just a tiny little bit flat because of the solid color on the inside. So I just wanted to mention that, a different option if you wanted to add, or you wanted there to be a little bit more color variation on the inside. Another option would be to have some of that foiled background in, say, a different color on the inside. I think that would look kind of cool too. After doing the gazebo, assembling that, I glued the glitter part, which is the snow part, to the top. And then I started putting started putting glue on my little light string, and then realized I had to add the window inserts first. These pieces were die cut out of that acorn cardstock, so they're the same darker brown as some of the accents on the gazebo, but the light string goes right in front of it, so you want to make sure to glue that in place before you glue those lights down there. So I do have those lights to the side. There's glue on them, but it's facing up. So I should be quick enough to be able to get it in place before that glue starts to set. So once we have those lights in there, or those window inserts in there, we can put those lights down. This die set also has pieces to make the lights. I have those die cut out of the pearl cardstock, so I'll glue those on once I have my gazebo piece assembled and ready to go. For the background for this, I'm going to be using one of the foiled backgrounds that has the windy cardstock with the prism speckle foil foiled image. I'm using a little bit of ink blending with the weathered wood distress ink, as well as the chipped sapphire. So we have a little bit, or a couple different variations of blue here. You don't necessarily need to use two because this gazebo fills a lot of area. You're not necessarily seeing both of them. So you could easily just choose one of them and just go with that if you wanted. Now I do typically trim down my backgrounds before doing the ink blending on them, because when you're doing the ink blending on them, it tends to be a little bit heavier around the outside edges. So by trimming them down first, I can make sure to utilize that. So my foiled image back there was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I'm using the solid hot foiled prism splatter background for my mat. That is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So we just have a really thin frame around it. Again, it's going to coordinate nicely with the foiled on the back, but it's not going to overtake the card. It's just going to frame it nicely and add just a bit of sparkle around it. So again, I added my snow on the bottom and just used my scissors to trim that off before gluing down my ink blended background here. And then our gazebo piece can get added to that front. And you can see that it covers most of the front of the card. If you wanted to have it on a card where you had a little bit more of the background showing, I would use a 5 by 7 card base and make it just a little bit larger. However, that foiled background is not going to be able to be 5 by 7, so you'll have some different you'd either have to use something different for the background, say one of the embossing folders, or you would have to have larger mats on your card in order to accommodate the size that that glimmer plate will foil. So once I have my gazebo on that background there, I want to glue my lights onto that little string. So there is a die that die cuts all the lights. I have them die cut out of the pearl finish of the antique white treasured cardstock pack. And then I'm going to add some glossy accents on them to give them some gloss as well as dimension to them. That pearl finish has a bit of a gold shimmer to them. So these lights have a little bit of a gold shimmer to them. I personally am a white Christmas lights girl. That is my favorite. I am personally not a fan of all the colored Christmas lights. My husband loves all the colored ones, but I just think the white ones just have a calm to them. And I just think they're really pretty. So that's what I opted to do on here, but it would be really easy to change it up to have colored lights with colored cardstock. The die for the lights themselves are really quite tiny, so you could use a bunch of different colored cardstock scraps if you wanted to have those colors in there. So once those are glued down, I'm just using a dot of the glossy accents on those lights, and then I will let that completely dry. I wanted my tree to have a little bit of decoration to it, so I'm using some silver Nuvo drops to add some silver looking ornaments to the tree. It's going to have the look of silver, but it's also going to have the dimension, the curved dimension that Nuvo drops tend to do. You could also use liquid pearls for this. That would work exactly the same as well. Another option would be just to use, say, die cut circles in different cardstocks, whatever color you're wanting for those ornaments, and then glue those on and add, say, glossy accents or something on there if you wanted to have that curved dimension to them. You do need to obviously let that dry, just like the glossy accents. So I set that aside to dry while working on the next card. So the next card, this is where I'm using the tree from the Snow Day Friends die of the month, as well as the little child and sled from the Window Wonderland large die of the month. So I have that tree die cut out of that mint cardstock. I'm using the evergreen bough distress ink to ink around it. For my little child, I have some of the pieces die cut out of indigo cardstock, some of them die cut out of blush, and then some out of the chiffon. The chiffon is just a really, really pale pink, so I'll typically use that for the faces and, say, the legs or whatnot. Because it's part of the color palette that I created or that I'm using for this, I'm using it for those areas. And then the pink itself is for the jacket and the scarf, as well as the indigo is for the shorts and the scarf. So I did do a little bit of ink blending on the clothes dies for this one, just to add a little bit of that visual dimension to it. Then I'm just using that same Barely Art glue to glue everything together. Now, when I have pieces like this that have a lot of pieces to them, what I will typically do, and I did that for the first die cut card with the two children on it, I will put all of my pieces on my desk like I just did here, putting them where kind of in order of where they go. So for these people, I started at the bottom and kind of worked my way to the top. And I just find it's easiest to organize my brain while I'm creating when I'm doing that. Often when die cut things have a lot of pieces to them, people get overwhelmed by all of those pieces. So by organizing them on your surface, and you know exactly which piece goes where, you know exactly which piece goes next, it takes some of that overwhelmingness out of it. And then by using that liquid glue, I can move and shimmy things in place nice and easily. And it really, the pieces come together quite easily. It takes longer, I think, to die cut the pieces than it does to assemble them. But in my opinion, pieces like this that have a lot of little pieces to them have so much more detail. They have so much more dimension, and they just have a really nice look on the front of cards. They're my favorites once they're completed, but I know for some people they find them quite overwhelming because of all those pieces. So by laying them out on your desk, putting all the pieces together where they go and kind of having it organized like that, I think that takes a little bit of that out of it. So once that is all together, I can put that under my acrylic block to dry. Now, by putting that acrylic block over that, it just holds everything in place. It holds everything nice and flat. It makes sure that the glue has good contact, and it frees up your hands to be working on other things. Nothing frustrates me more than holding something down while the glue dries. So by having it under an acrylic block, I can have that being held in place or whatnot, and I can be working on other things. So I added the little bows and ribbons to the gifts, put those underneath my acrylic block. And then the last step here for assembling die cuts is the snowy bits on top of that tree. Those are also die cut out of that glitter cardstock. So we have some nice shimmer to them. Another option would be to do this in white and then say put some stickles on there. If you didn't necessarily want them completely covered in glitter, you could add, say, stickles to the bottom edge of the snowy edge, or just all of the round outside edges of the white cardstock for the snow. So that's another option there if you didn't have white glitter cardstock. So once that tree is done, we have all of our elements for the front of the card. This is the one where I'm going to do another one of those brick backgrounds. I just really love this embossing folder, which is so funny because it's such a simple, basic thing. And there's been other brick folders, but I really love the size of these bricks and I love the variation in them. So once again, I taped my cardstock in place. I'm just using hammermill cardstock here. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. I embossed it once without ink, and then I'm taking some Versamark ink, putting it on the embossing folder. So when you tape your piece in place, you want to feel your embossing folder where you feel the bricks are raised. That's where you're taping your paper. Where you feel the other side and it's the mortar part or the grout part of the brick, that part is raised. That's the part that you want to put the ink on. So once I put the Versamark ink on there, close it, put it through my embossing or my die cutting machine, pull it out, and now I can put that same Lost Shadow Distress glaze on there. I really liked that gray color, so I stuck with it for this one. So the change that I'm going to make with my colors is I'm not going to be using the pink. I'm going to be using some of that evergreen bough on that background, so it's going to tie in the color of the tree. This background's a little bit more subtle than the other one just because I don't have that pink. That pink is, in my opinion, not something that you would expect on a brick wall, not like you'd expect blue either, but I think the green blends a little bit easier with the blues rather than the pink. The pink is more kind of a pop of color in there. So once I have my embossing completely done, I can trim this down and I can do my inking on there. Now, when I ink the backgrounds, I will typically do, say, the lighter colors first and kind of work my way dark. I don't want to go in with the darker colors and not have any area for those lighter colors afterwards. So by doing the lighter colors first, and in this case, I'll do that evergreen bough first, then I'll go in with that weathered wood, and then I will go in with the chipped sapphire. I can make sure that I only have a little bit of area with that dark color. So I will typically do an odd number of areas. So in this case, for the size of piece that I'm using, I did 3 areas there. And then I'm going in with that weathered wood. I wanted to make sure that I didn't have any green that I was going to contaminate with that weathered wood. So I just used that piece of paper towel, and you can see how much ink came off. That is any ink that was on top of that distress glaze. So that just shows you how much ink might have been on the grout lines had I not had them embossed there. So after going in with that weathered wood, I could go in with that chipped sapphire and just add some darker areas to my background. I can pull that off, and then we'll be ready to start assembling our card. So for this one, I'm going to use some indigo cardstock for my mat. So that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My brick piece was trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And by having all of my die cuts done and ready to go, assembled, ready to go, it makes the card making part, the card assembling part, really quick and easy to do. So I put that mat on there first, then I can put on that brick piece. I do, once again, want to make sure to put a decent amount of glue on the back part of that brick piece so I know that it's really got some good contact with the base. For this snow piece, I know that brick piece is 3 3/4 inches wide, so I just use my trimmer to trim that down to 3 3/4 inches wide. So if by chance you forget to put your snow piece on before assembling it, this is an easy way to do it. Just trim it down in your trimmer, put that straight edge against the top part of the trimmer, and it's really easy to line it up. Then I glue down that tree. And then I glue down the sled before I glue down the figure because I want to make sure that the hand from the figure, from the little child, lines up with the handle of the sled. I don't want that to move on me. Then I'm going to add those gifts on top of that sled. The front of the die package has them all stacked in one. I'm going to kind of stagger them together so that they're not one tall pile. I don't want to cover too much of that tree. But again, adding that acrylic block on the areas that need to dry means that your hands are free for doing other things. So for this one here, once again, I'm going to use one of the foiled sentiments, but because I have some heat embossed sentiments as well as foiled sentiments, I can pick and choose which one I think looks better on that background. So that's another reason why it's great to have those options and have those pieces there ready to go, ready to grab, ready to pick and choose between each one of them, which one looks best. So the next card I'm using the stitching die of the month, our Peppermint Prancer. So I have a few pieces die cut with the blush cardstock here. I want to do a little bit of ink blending with my picked raspberry distress ink. I have the holly die cut out of mint cardstock, so I used a little bit of the evergreen bough to do ink blending on that. Sometimes I'll ink blend before stitching, and sometimes I won't do the ink blending on it at all. It just depends on the final look that I want. For these, I just thought it would add a little bit of visual dimension to it if they had ink blending on them. So I ink blend them, let that dry for just a moment, and while I'm letting that ink dry, I'm going to assemble my reindeer. Now, I wasn't really thinking here. I couldn't decide if I wanted to ink blend my reindeer or not, and this ended up deciding it for me. I had a brain blank here and wanted the eyes behind my reindeer to be the dark brown color. Ink blended those black back legs and then realized that the dark cardstock that I had for the antlers would color in those eyes. So by doing that, that made the decision for me whether I wanted to ink blend the rest of the reindeer, because as soon as I put the front piece on those legs, I realized the legs were ink blended. So I needed to do the front so that that matched. Sometimes it's funny how things happen that way. I think it looks better ink blended, but sometimes I think I go a little bit too far with too much ink blending. So I pick and choose what I do and don't do. And sometimes I'm not in the mood for it. Sometimes I am. So this, I think it looks better with that ink blending on it. So assembled everything together. The only piece left to add to this reindeer is the nose, and that's one of the stitching pieces that I will do in just a moment. But it'll be great because this can dry while I'm doing all of that stitching. Little inside ear pieces, I just put some dots of glue on there and then used my jewel picker to pick up those pieces to place them on the front of that reindeer. It makes it really easy to get them with perfect placement. I'm going to do all of my stitching with pink floss here. I have DMC number 605. It's kind of a medium shade, so it's a little bit lighter than that raspberry ink that I use, but it's a little bit darker than the cardstock, the blush cardstock color. So I have a length of floss. I just pull out 2 strands. When I'm doing my stitching dies, I typically like to do 2 strands. This back piece of my ornament is done with that pearl finish of the antique white cardstock. So when you tilt it in the light, it's got some beautiful shimmer to it. That's one of the reasons why I didn't ink blend that piece, because it wouldn't take the ink. It has a finish to it. When I'm doing my stitching, I pull the thread through, and then I do use a piece of Best Ever Craft tape to tape that thread end. When you use the stitching dies, they will put lines right in your die cut, showing you exactly where those floss pieces are supposed to go. So when I pulled my thread through, I can see the lines where that stitching is supposed to go, and I just follow those. It makes it really easy to do that stitching. And I'm choosing to do the same color stitching for all of the pieces that I'm doing for this particular one, but you can definitely change them up. So I'm using pink floss on the pearl cardstock here, and then I'm using that same pink floss on the pink cardstock, but you could say do white floss on the pink cardstock if you wanted a little bit of contrast there, or you can even use, say, some silver metallic floss to do this because it is, you know, a Christmas ornament. That would be fantastic as well. So adding the stitching just gives it some extra texture that, in my opinion, makes the die cut, it just takes them to the next level. It just gives them a little bit of a different look, has an interesting look to it. So once I finished off that strand of floss, I did exactly the same as when I started out. I finished it off by using a tiny piece of Best Ever Craft tape to tape the floss in place, and then started my next one, once again taping it in place. I tape it in place to make sure it doesn't move on me. When I know some people like to have a tail there and then they tie their string off at the end. This is what works for me. I don't want to be holding a loose string and accidentally pull it through. The other thing that I like to do when I'm doing stitching dies is I will cut a second piece. This particular piece here has an insert part for the stitching as well as an outside part. So I just use the outside part of the die cut some white cardstock, and then I glue those pieces together. So that not only adds extra dimension to the finished piece, but it also seals in the floss between those 2 pieces of cardstock, makes it easier to assemble my cards because I'm going to be assembling cardstock to cardstock. So this is something that I like to do. It's not necessary for when you're using the stitching dies. So if you wanted to omit that step, you absolutely could. I have some sewing clips that I like to use to hold those pieces together, and it just holds everything together while it's drying. Once again, freeing my hands to be working on other things. Again, I don't want to be sitting there holding something while it's drying, so those clips work really, really well for that. The next piece here that I'm putting together is the nose for the reindeer. So once again, it's that pink cardstock that I have ink blended around, and I'm using that same pink floss. When I started off, I used a little piece of Best Ever Craft tape to tape that floss in place. And when I finish, I'm going to be doing exactly the same thing. That piece of Best Ever Craft tape just holds that floss in place. Make sure that everything is nice and secure. And then once again, I used that die to cut a second one for the outside piece, and I'm gluing them together using a couple more of those sewing clips to hold everything together. At this point, the first part is probably likely dry, so I took a couple of those clips from there. I just have these sitting on my desk, and they work really, really perfectly for this particular application. And like I said, gluing that piece of cardstock to the back isn't a necessary step, but it adds some extra dimension, and it just makes it a lot easier when you're assembling your cards because you don't have the dimension of the floss on the back. Sometimes when you have that floss on the back of your pieces, the glue doesn't really get good contact with the base of your card or whatever you're gluing it to. So this eliminates that problem. So for the ornament piece, there are 4 of these little triangle pieces. I only have one of them on camera. I do the other ones off camera just because they're all exactly the same. Once again, starting off gluing or taping the end of my floss in place at the beginning as well as the end, and then die cutting a second triangle to glue to the back of it, and having that so that it adds that extra dimension and means that I only am gluing cardstock to cardstock when I'm assembling. So I have all 4 of those done now. I can glue those to this ornament. So I did 2 different colors to this ornament. You could easily do it monochromatic. You could do both the upper and lower pieces in the same color if you wanted to not have the 2 different colors. This goes really well with the name of this one, which is called Peppermint Prancer. So I thought the pink kind of made it look a little bit like a peppermint. But again, you can get really creative with your colors as well. You could use some metallic cardstock here for the upper pieces. I think that would look fantastic as well. So the little holly pieces, I'm just going to glue onto the top of the reindeer while it's drying. I set those aside while they were drying, and then I'm going to emboss my background. I'm using the Holiday Flurry embossing folder, and I'm using some mint cardstock. I'm not going to do any inking on the actual embossing folder for this. I'm going to keep that background really, really simple. So once I have that mint cardstock embossed, I'm trimming it down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And then I'm just using a little bit of that evergreen bow distressing to ink blend around the outside edges. And then when I have just a tiny little bit of ink left on my brush, I'll kind of move it towards the inside. So the inside's not super, super light compared to the outside of that embossed piece, but it does bring out the embossing when you do that ink blending there. So I kind of thought this looked a little bit, say, like, a tree behind it, that this was an ornament, say, on a tree-ish. So once I have that ink blended, I'm gluing that to the base of the card. I chose not to do a separate mat around the outside edge, but you easily could choose that pink cardstock and do that as a mat around, and that would coordinate nicely as well if you wanted to do that instead. Then I'm gluing on the ornament and then the reindeer on top. This die set also has a J and a Y to turn that ornament into the word joy. So once I have the ornament and the reindeer on there, then I'm gluing down that J and the Y. Now I just have a single layer of cardstock here, but you could have multiple layers of cardstock if you wanted to add some bulk to those letters and like a little bit of extra dimension to them. To add just a touch of extra texture to this, I'm using dots of stickles on top of the berries that are on the reindeer's head, and then a little bit of glossy accents in the eyes, so that in the eyes we have a little bit of shine, glossy shine to it. And then we have an adorable card that has a ton of texture to it. For the last card, I'm going to be using the caboodle of the month, which is called The Magic for You. I'm using one of my foiled backgrounds. This one was done on that windy cardstock with that speckled prism foil. I'm going to do ink blending on that background, but I'm going to do it similar to my last brick background. I'm not doing it how I typically do my ink blended backgrounds, which is kind of symmetrical. So because of the sentiment, believe in the magic, I kind of wanted it to look ish like kind of a magical mystical sky, maybe a little bit northern lightsy ish. So I'm using that evergreen bough first, and then I'm going in with the weathered wood and then with that chipped sapphire. I do have some areas where that windy cardstock is exposed, so I'm not completely covering that. You could also add in a little bit of that spun sugar color if you wanted. However, because we have that blue cardstock behind it, it's not going to be as bright pink as if we were to do that ink blending on white cardstock. For my die cuts for this, I did them in that blush cardstock, and I'm doing a little bit of ink blending on them with that picked raspberry distressing, just to add a little bit of visual dimension to it. I'm also doing a matte for this with that pink cardstock, and I added a little bit of that picked raspberry just to tie it in with those die cuts a little bit more. I'm not ink blending around the entire thing. You could see that I did it kind of randomly so that we have a little bit of that dark pink that ties in, but we still have a little bit of that light color too. So that pink mat was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Our ink blended foiled background is trimmed to 3 3/8 inches by 5 inches. The Believe in Magic die cut also has a solid piece behind it. I just did it in white. Most of the time when you're using those type of dies, you don't really see the inside of the letters, but I always do a back piece just at the off chance that some of those are exposed. And then I glued on that Believe in Magic and then glued on the U next, and then kind of overlapped the 4 a little bit, just for a little bit of interest on it. So once I have that done, it's a super simple card, but I really love it with that foiled background. I think it works really well with that sentiment. This one I think would also be a fantastic die set that would work really, really well with the Steamboat Willie duo, the Mickey and Minnie Mouse dies that have come out in the last few months, as well as their holiday companion die sets. I think the sentiment would be perfect for that, especially that Believe in Magic would be great for that. So there we have that caboodle card with that just beautiful foiled background. Then we have our stitched reindeer card, and stitching cards just have so much natural dimension to them with that added stitching to that. And that little reindeer is just absolutely adorable. Then we have our card that has the brick background with one of the dies, the tree die from the die of the month, the child and sleigh from the large die of the month. Lots of texture and finish in that too. Then we have our gazebo from the large die of the month. This one I think would be really, really fun to play with. You could use it for different seasons as well. Leave off that snow and put other things in that gazebo, I think would be fantastic. Then our little snowman making friends with that foiled background and ink blended background. That foil just really adds a little bit of extra sparkle and shimmer to those backgrounds that take them to the next level. And then we have our absolutely adorable snowman card. Just such a cute little image. And by adding some stickles as well as some transparent gloss texture paste, it also has some sparkle and shine to it that just makes it a little bit, it takes it next level and makes it not quite as flat as just a plain stenciled image. Then our first brick background with a little bit of that pink as well as the stamped and embossed tree on the front with some metallic accents on there. And I just showed the comparison between those two brick backgrounds, and that pink just takes it in a different direction, makes it look a little bit different. Then our embossing folder of the month background, again, a really simple but beautiful background, perfect for winter cards and projects. Then our little snowman BetterPress plate. These snowmen are absolutely adorable and just make a really great background for winter cards. And then our very first card with that brass foil and the gold wax seal that I didn't think I was going to use, but ended up being the only wax seal that I used because, like I said, as I was creating the rest of the cards, there just wasn't a really good place for the other colors of wax seal to go where I thought they looked like they belonged. I hope you enjoyed the inspiration from the October 2025 clubs for Spellbinders. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. Have a fantastic day.